In this next video, in our short and sweet Photoshop retouching series, we'll be looking at frequency separation and how that can be used to help improve our portrait photography. Okay, so now that we've cleaned up the skin a little bit using the spot healing brush tool, we can see that we've got that on its own clone layer. So if I turn that off, we can get back to the original. And we can see that we haven't taken away from the integrity of the texture of the skin on the original image. We're just cleaning up some of those spots, so it still looks realistic, still looks like the person. And it's important that we do that before we enter into the frequency separation part of the process. So now that I've got the clone layer, I want to do Shift Option Command E or Shift Option Control E to merge up onto a second layer. And I'm just going to rename that merge. So that's just basically taking my background layer, it's merged it with the clone layer, so now I've got a flattened layer sitting above my original. Now what we're going to do is have a look at the frequency separation process. So the first thing we're going to do is create a couple of copies of my merged layer. And I'll do that by clicking and dragging that down on top of the new layer button, which creates a copy, or I can also do Command or Control J on the keyboard to make a duplicate of the layer. And with the layer that's sitting on top, I'm just going to rename that one high. And then with the layer that's sitting underneath, I'll rename that one low. So starting with the low layer, what I'm going to do is just hide the high layer for the moment. And on the low layer, this is essentially going to be our blurred layer that will help to soften the effect that we're about to run. So with that low layer selected, I'm going to come up to my filters and come from filter down to my blur filters. And then I'll go down to the Gaussian blur, which is a common filter that we use in Photoshop. And looking at the Gaussian blur radius, I want to drag the slider there to the right until I'm basically getting a blur that's strong enough that I'm starting to lose some of the definition around the eyelashes. That's probably a good place to look. You sort of want to take it to a point where you almost lose the eyelashes, not completely. I want to sort of bring that down anywhere from like 5 through to 9 is good. Okay, so I'm going to set mine, take it to about 6 on there. And if I hit the preview off and on there, we can see how much that's blurring. I can use my little preview menu here as well, just to zoom in on certain areas. All right, I'll click OK on that. And I'm ready to work on the high layer. So I'll come across and turn the high layer on, select it from there. And with the high layer selected, I'm then going to come up to my image menu, and then from there come down to apply image. Under apply image, I've got my source. That's just the name of the file that I'm currently working on. I'm just going to leave it set to that. With the layer that I've got that it's referring to, I want to make sure that the high layer is actually referring to the layer directly underneath the low layer. And the channel I want to be working in is the RGB channel. And with the blending mode, I'm going to make sure that one is set to subtract. So I'll come down to subtract. Great. Now I've got my two values over here. The opacity should be set up at 100%. My scale should be set at 2. And then the offset should be at 128. Now, in terms of remembering those settings, don't worry too much about having to write those down, because what you can do is once you've done this once, you can set this up as an action so that anytime you need to do a frequency separation, you can go to your actions panel and just action that. So we'll take a look at actions in the next video. So I'm just going to click OK on that. And so we can see what's happening here in the layers panel with this high layer. Essentially, that's our details, that's our texture, and then our low layer is the softened version. So what we want to do is combine these two so that they essentially recreate the merged layer, which has the standard texture that was originally there. So to do that, I just come up to my blending mode from here and then come down to linear light. And so I should see now that with the high layer set at linear light, it's blending with the low layer underneath it, and my image is back to being a sharp image that has the texture now separated out on the high layer. And now what we can do is we can work on a layer between these two to help smooth out some of these inconsistencies in the light and texture. Frequency separation can be used for doing things like dodging and burning. If I wanted to darken shadows or lighten them, I can use it for that. I can also use it for lightening or further lightening highlights, or I could bring the highlights back and make them more like midtones. But in this case, what we're going to try and do is just smooth out some of the bumps and the inconsistency that we've got on the light around this model's cheek. There's quite a sharp transition from midtones through to shadows there, and we just want to make that a little bit smoother. So what I'm going to do is come across, I'll select the low layer, and then I'm going to add a new layer between these two just by coming down and hitting the new layer button. And then I can just rename that layer. I'll just call this one my retouch layer. And it's within this layer that I'm going to paint, essentially. So I'm going to come across, I'm going to grab my brush tool from the keyboard. You can either hit B or come across and select it from there. And then I want to come up to the brush settings again and make sure that I've got a brush that's the right size. I want to bring this down to a size where it's going to be relatively large enough to straddle this transition from dark to light around here. I might even make it a little bit bigger than what it currently is. That's sitting at about 150. Let's take it up to about 170. It's going to vary depending on the quality and resolution of your image. And with the hardness, I want that set down at 0 because I want a really soft airbrushed edge to the brush. With the opacity level, I want to take that opacity level down. So I'll take it down to about 10% because we can slowly build this up as we go. And if you're using a Wacom tablet, then you can play around with the flow and the smoothing. But I'm not a Wacom, I'm using a mouse at the moment, so I'll leave that. So finally, before I start painting on this, I've got to make sure that I've got my foreground color set. And essentially what I'm looking at is I'm trying to make sure that this transition from the midtones into the dark is a little smoother. So I want to sample a color that represents the midtones here, and I'll brush over the top of this transition area. So I can do that by holding down the Option or Alt key on a PC, and I can just select an area of midtone there. And you can see that when I do that, if I have a look at the foreground color over here, that's probably a good representation of what the midtone color is. And so I might zoom in just a little bit closer here now and start by painting across the chin here. And I'll just drag across slightly. And we can see that as I do that, because I've got the opacity set down at 10%, it's more of a subtle approach. But you can see that if I come across and turn that retouch layer off, what it's doing there, it's just sort of lightening the shadow a little bit, and it's smoothing out that transition between the midtones and the shadows. You could even reduce the opacity down further if you wanted to do it in smaller increments. I might even bring the size of my brush up. I'm just going to hit the right squiggly bracket on the keyboard to increase the size of the brush. And then I'll just try smoothing over the top of this area here. Okay, so we can see what that's done there. I'll just turn that on and off. So I might have pushed it a little bit too far. I can always pull back on that by coming across, and I could use the eraser tool to remove or delete any of the pixels that I've drawn on there. Okay, so if you find that you pull that shadow back too far, then you can always sample a new color within the shadows and paint back over the top. So if I hold down the Option or Alt key again, I'll come up to some shadowed area here. So I've sampled that, and we can see here in my foreground color, I've got a much darker color now to paint with. And then I can come in and I can actually pull some of that shadow back into the side of the face. And so now it's just a case of working my way around the face to try and smooth up some areas. We've got some highlights over here that I might want to pull back a little bit to make them a little more matte. So again, I'll bring the size of the brush down a little bit with my left squiggly bracket. I'll sample a new color holding Option or Alt and just click within those midtones, which has changed that foreground color. And then I can just slowly paint over these areas where there's a bit of shine on the face. And that will help to just neutralize the skin. I could even do it on the tip of the nose there. If I just select a color that's sort of close to that, I'll reduce the point size of my brush a little bit, and I can just slowly sort of paint over the top of that to reduce that highlight. And so it's just a case of going around and deciding, this is probably looking a little too harsh now compared to the smoothing that's happening down here. So I can come up and again, just click with the Option or Alt to sample some color over here. I'll increase the size of the brush and then just come in and smooth that area. So So I'm doing this very quickly at the moment. You do want to take your time when you're doing this and work around the face. You can work in larger sort of areas. You don't want to work too small because it's going to look a little bit painterly or a bit strange if you work in smaller sort of blocks. You just want to do larger sort of blocks when you're doing this. And so you can see that it's not only smoothed, but you can also use this to dodge and burn as well. So if you do want to deepen shadows in certain areas, or if you want to increase highlights in certain areas, using frequency separation is a good way to do that. So for example, if I wanted to maybe darken these ends of the hair over here, then I can come across and sample a darker color of the hair, and then come over and then I can just sort of paint over the top of the hair there. And at the moment, I don't actually have the hair or the subject deep etched or masked from the background. If I was doing the hair like this, what I would normally do is mask the background off so that it's not affected by this frequency separation. At the moment, I'm most likely painting over the top of the background there, but if you mask the background out, you can avoid that, and it just makes it a bit easier to keep the frequency separation within the confines of the subject. And so now if I just come across and I'll just turn our retouch layer off, and we can see at the dramatic change that has made. It's been a very quick approach, but basically I'm able to very quickly change the effect of that. If I wanted to reduce the intensity of that, I could also just keep that layer selected and then bring the opacity of that layer down so that we do start to see some of the original image still coming through. So if you find that the effect is maybe a bit too intense, you've always got the option to bring that layer down to bring back some of the original image. So that's just a quick intro to how we can use frequency separation to help smooth out skin tone, especially if there's a bit of inconsistency and very sharp transitions between your highlights, midtones and your shadows, and help smooth out the skin without completely changing your subject's face, because we don't want to go in and change the look of somebody. Cool. So this has been a quick introduction to how frequency separation can help to smooth those inconsistencies out in our portrait photography. This has been part of our retouching series in Photoshop, and in the next couple of videos we'll be looking at how we can sharpen up parts of the image such as the eyes and the lips to add more emphasis and interest in those areas. And we'll see you in the next video.